Hello, humane marketers. Sarah Znakrocha here. Welcome to another episode of the Humane Marketing Podcast, a place to be for the generation of marketers who cares. This is the show where we talk about marketing your business in a way that feels good to you, is aligned with your values, and also resonates more with your conscious customers because it's not pushy, ethical, and also beautiful. So if you're a regular here, you know that I'm organizing the conversations around the 7 Ps of humane marketing. And if you're new here and this is your first time, welcome. I'm so excited you're here. You may want to download your one-page marketing plan with the 7 Ps of humane marketing in the form of a mandala at humane.marketing/one page, the number one and page. So again, humane.marketing/one page. And with that, with no further ado, let's dive into today's conversation. Hey, Hillary. So nice to have you here. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, Sarah, thanks for having me. I've been thinking about our conversation all week.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, it's been more than a week. I was just saying offline that we connected like many months before. And so I'm just excited to have this different approach that you bring to storytelling. But as you know, we're kind of putting this under the P of personal power. And I think it really is a good fit because you do bring that different approach about storytelling coming from this personal power. And actually, that's where I'd like to start. You talk about superpowers, and we talk about superpowers in marketing as well, like finding out your humane marketing superpowers that you can bring more of you to your marketing. And so tell us why that matters in your storytelling approach.
Yeah, it's funny because when I think of the word marketing, or maybe flashback a handful of years ago in my perception of marketing, I was always told, oh, it's about the other person. It's about who you're marketing to. And
Right.
while I still agree with that, I think when I was able to make this shift of, okay, yes, it's about that other person who I'm communicating with, but I also need it to be about me as the communicator. And that's why storytelling and sharing a story from my own life that connects to who I am, my superpowers, what I put out into the world is so important. And I think this idea of personal power with storytelling is each of us as the storyteller, has control over our narrative. So I can choose what experiences from my life I share with other people. And sure, other people might have stories about me, stories about my company, my brand, and there might be stories I tell myself that maybe aren't the nicest or the truest. But if I really zero in and focus on the story I choose to express outwardly to other people, to me, that's where the power is, and that personal power and light. And how that connects with superpowers is I can find the experiences in my life that support what I consider my superpowers. Or when I'm working with clients on their storytelling, we do a full exercise that helps them identify what their superpowers are. And then we continue the brainstorming of, oh, what are the experiences that you've had in your life, looking at all aspects of your life that really support these superpowers, and how can you craft that into the narrative that makes the most sense for your
Mm-hmm.
audience.
Yeah, I love that. It's a very similar approach to what we do in the marketing, like we're human program, because we need to first go deep and figure out, who are we and what's our story. And we're gonna talk a little bit later about this origin story, or you have another name for it. So who am I? But then also, yeah, how does that connect with my ideal client? And I'm so glad you brought this up. It's like this idea of marketing being only about the client And as I just said offline, I'm currently recording the Marketing Like We're Human book. And I was taught that the client is always king, right? That's kind of like one of these marketing things. It's like the client is king, and kind of thinking, oh, everything I do has to serve this client, then makes you think, oh, people don't even care about who I am and what my stories are. I have to focus everything on this, yeah, outside source. And I'm so glad you brought this up, that this is really like a reframe. It's like, yeah, the client is important. And yes, we want to understand them. But in order to actually resonate, we need to first also find out who we are and what our stories are. And that means finding out these superpowers. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what I learned early on in sharing stories from my own life, I started as a performer, telling my own stories on stage in front of audiences. And at the time, I think I went into it thinking like, oh, I'm funny, I can entertain people. But what I soon learned and felt is that a story isn't one-sided, and there's that automatic reciprocity and exchange with a listening audience. They're hearing my story, they're taking it in. If there's opportunity for conversation after, people tend to share stories of their own lives that
Mhm.
connect or resonate somehow. And when I was able to trust that storytelling was a conversation, I trusted myself more, that I could, again, like channel what's inside of me, channel the experiences I've had and who I am, to then have that conversation with an audience.
Right. So it's not like you're not just telling the story to avoid, you actually want there to be feedback, right? That's the communication and connection part. It's like we're not just doing this as performers. Even, I would say, even performers, they want feedback from the audience, otherwise they wouldn't do it. So yeah, it's so interesting. So that kind of leads us then, I already hinted at it, as this origin story, right? That we're, again, it's another thing that I guess we hear a lot from storytelling experts. We have to have this origin story, and we need to tell it in a compelling way. You have there as well, kind of suggesting a reframe. So tell us about how you call it and what's different with the
Sure.
origin story.
Yeah, early on in starting my business, I used the phrase origin story for everything. And I would say I work with a lot of business owners, entrepreneurs, and also leaders of larger companies. And for everyone, I would say what you just said, of you have to have an origin story. And there would be this immediate wave of overwhelm of,
Mm.
oh my goodness, I have to start from the very beginning of my life and like take everyone through my education, my expertise, my awards, my accolades. And then what if I've changed my business or changed my career, or another thing in my life has changed? How do I explain that? And there was always this pressure of, it has to be this all encompassing story. I have to make sense of myself, make sure people understand who I am. And there would also be times where I would be listening to other podcasts and hosts would say, oh, so what's your origin story? And again, there would be like this long winded response from people where you know that they're trying to get to the end, but the preparation or the thought put into it maybe wasn't considered as much. And so when I started teaching storytelling, I defined origin story to be less overwhelming. And it's a story that answers two questions: how did you get to where you are now? And how did you get your superpowers? And so, again, going back to superpowers, I do a really intensive exercise with my clients around identifying what those are. And then when we get to that question, the how did you get to where you are now, which is pretty standard for an origin story, I splice the question in half and I reverse it. So it's, where are you now? And how did you get there? And by focusing on the where are you now, it allows people to tap into the presence of, where am I now in my business? Where am I now in my
Mhm.
life? Where am I now in terms of how I want to communicate with other people? And once you have that, it's really finding those moments in your life that illuminate that, that support that. So it doesn't necessarily mean starting at the I was born moment or the birth of the business moment. It could really be a more recent moment in time that supports who you are, what you do, what you stand for. And so that is to me and to everyone I work with, a really liberating way to think about it. Again, it's a way to tap into that personal power and strength of like, this is who I am now, and this might change. And when it changes, I can adjust my story as such. And then really in the last handful of months, I've decided not to use the word origin story at all, because I don't want that overwhelm and that pressure to envelop people and hold them back from sharing their story or finding their story. And I saw that it still was overwhelming people. And so I've landed on this new term called core story that still has that same definition, but it helps people stay again in that inner strength and personal power as they're communicating outward.
Yeah, so much good stuff in there. And I think I will have to kind of adapt the way I talk about I don't think I ever mentioned the word origin story, but we talk about in the Marketing Like We're Human program, creating our story. So I don't really use origin or core, but it's true that there's some kind of overwhelm when people are first thinking about, what is my story? And so I totally agree with you on that overwhelm part. What I'm wondering, and I'd like to hear from you, is like, because when they actually do write the story, and sometimes they have to go like really deep, but eventually when it does come out, it may be too long, but they feel like such a big sense of relief that they have actually put it on paper and they see it. And it's almost like it's healing to work through that story. What's your take on that healing part of putting it on paper?
Yeah. So when I work with my clients, we work on this core story for 2 months.
Right.
So it starts out rather large in terms
Okay.
of spanning time or diving deep into like a period of life that supports the person where they are
Right.
now and what they want to talk about. And often in that, there's a letting go of old narratives. So whether it's the story they're used to telling about themselves and their
Yeah.
business, or like an inner voice that's been telling a story for a long time, sometimes that just comes out in the crafting process.
Right.
And once it's out there, I often hear, oh, that's definitely not the story. I'm really glad that I said it now and I don't need to say it again. And so
Right.
that tends to happen. And as I continue to work with people and fine tune the story, I do something called zoom in. And so as someone's sharing their story, I will pause them in our work together and say, zoom in on what it felt like in the garden when you had that idea.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is each person goes into specifics, goes into details, like visual details, sensorial details, what they were feeling, a new perspective now as a storyteller on how they were feeling then. And those are the moments that stick in the story. So there isn't really a necessity for like extra backstory or extra details. It's really finding the moments of specificity and finding the moments of movement in the story. And what that ends up doing is it does shorten it, and each storyteller still understands the context of everything, but the audience doesn't necessarily need that context, which is
Yeah, this
also
is so
really
good.
powerful to
Mm-hmm.
let go of the extra.
Yeah, this is so good. I'm going to share this episode with the group right now, even though it goes out in a few weeks, because I think that is kind of maybe the missing piece. It's like, yes, you need to, at least I think for me, I'm still going to tell them, look, yes, write your story. And it seems like that's what you're saying as well. You're working on this. And so it may be a lot longer at the beginning, but then you work your way back and kind of come to the essentials, and therefore the term your core story, and it makes it easier for the reader to then connect the dots, right, rather than having all this extra fluff that people go, how is that even relevant here?
Yeah, and when there's a written version of the story, the core story, I still approach everything from a spoken version
Right.
place. So a lot of my clients, all of them actually, have to do both. They have to go through a process where there's writing involved, but I also make them practice with what I call low stakes audiences. So trusted friends,
Mhm.
business besties, not so much family members or partners, but people in your life that you feel comfortable around, but might not already know everything about you. And in that practice work, especially trying it with different audiences, they continue to find the story and find, again, what's worth sharing and what needs to be shared when there's a listening audience there.
Yeah.
So even when it goes back to written form and you don't know who's there connecting with your story, you can still, again, feel the connection and feel the conversation of those live spoken experiences.
Yeah, so good. We talked about superpowers. So I'm curious, what are your superpowers and how do you use them in your storytelling business?
Yeah. So I love this question. I have two worksheets that I give my clients in the brainstorming phase of their core story work. And one is identifying superheroes and what connects. And that could be like fictional characters, people alive now, people from history,
Hmm.
people that are close to the person. It could be anybody really. But I make them do that, identify what connects those people together and what connects you to those people in terms of values or accomplishments or feelings, things like that. And then I transition them to the super powers worksheet, and I hadn't done it for myself. And so, in preparation for this podcast yesterday, I took some time and I filled out both of those worksheets. And it was so difficult. And I now have so much more respect. I have even more respect for my clients because it is a really hard task to do. And so there's a list of 10 superpowers, like for them to brainstorm. And then there's the Desert Island 3. If you had to choose only 3, what would they be? So the 3 that I chose from my list of 10, I'm looking down at my paper,
Hmm.
my voice, my visual imagination, and the fact that I'm an opportunity creator.
Mm.
And it was really hard to land on those, but I feel like they encompass who I am as a human, who I am as a leader, who I am as a business owner. And they are things that I can tap into and share stories about, but also just inform how I take up space and show up in the world. So I feel
Mm.
really good about what I landed on, but it was pretty
It was
difficult.
hard. Yeah. Of course, we're
Yeah.
now curious what the other 7 are. Can you read those to us?
Yeah, sure. So I said feedback. And it's interesting because I know I'm really good at giving feedback. I had a job many years ago where I was trained in like a very specific feedback style, and I've carried it through into my business, but it's also things that I hear. Like that is something I hear from clients of like, wow, you're so good at giving feedback.
Hmm.
So I claim that. My listening ear. So I have a degree in music. I'm a trained singer, and we had to
Mm.
take classes in college
Yeah.
that literally trained our ear. But I know that informs how I hear stories and what I connect to and how I can help people in that way. I said my visual imagination. That's like just in terms of what I see possible, but then also how I bring stories to life and how I help people bring stories to life.
Hmm.
Commitment to self, which
Mm.
is one I've like really worked on over time, but feel like that is a power that I like now have that's unwavering. My comedic lens. So my background, a bit of my background is in comedy as well. And my partner and I are always in competition about who's funnier. And he said the other day that skill, he still thinks he's like naturally funnier. I don't know if I agree, but skills wise, I am the funnier
Okay.
person. A vision for what's possible. So that's for myself, for other people, for the world. Like my vision for if everyone using storytelling and what's possible, if that was the case.
Hmm.
Ooh. My feet. And so that has to do with my sense of groundedness, but also I'm a tap
Mm.
dancer and I actually hear stories and rhythms. And
Oh,
I like think
wow.
about it like in terms of tap dancing. And
Yeah.
then also my feet in terms of like my convictions, like I am grounded in like what I stand for and what I
Hmm.
believe in. And for my voice, the one I shared of my top 3, it's the way I use my voice to take up space and share stories, but also my singing voice and knowing that that's there to support me as well. Number 9, determination. And 10 was opportunity creator. And again, that's for myself and for other people, and just knowing that, yeah, opportunities can come, but they can also be created.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I can see how that must have been really hard. First, I was thinking you gave people a list with the different superpowers, but no, you came up with those 10 for you specifically. So everybody has to come up with 10 or however many on their own, right? And
Yeah, and it's
yeah.
amazing what people come up with because
Mhm.
it's in their own like language and framework for how they move through the world.
Yeah.
And then there's some that are shared by so many people, which I
Yeah.
think is really great. But no, I don't people have to come up with their own list, but the superheroes exercise is a springboard into that list because they already start to identify, ooh,
Okay.
what connects me to this group of people that I like
Right.
really respect, that inform my life in some way. So
Yeah.
it's definitely one leads in to the other for
Nice.
sure.
I just shared one of mine on a LinkedIn post recently, so it's top of mind. One of mine is starting with the no. So meaning I always look at how can we simplify, streamline, make things easier, less overwhelming. So that's kind of one of my superpowers, I think, and like just very straightforward and yeah, simplifying things.
I love that. And I can already imagine so many stories
Hmm.
where there were things in your life where when you started with the no, what happened, or moments in your life where you maybe should have started with the no, but you can share them as a learning
Yeah.
experience too. That's so cool.
Exactly. Yeah, that's wonderful. All right. I'm really excited also to go into the next topic, which is the hero journey
Mm.
topic that you and I had some interesting email conversations about already. You know, it's part of that storytelling vocabulary, and a lot of storytellers follow that hero journey. And I actually wrote in the book, I'm like, I think I'm actually getting tired of that same old hero journeys story. And so when you and I talked via email, you shared some interesting thoughts on that. So I'd love to hear them here.
Yeah, it's interesting because I felt a pressure that I don't even think I realized I had to have a hero's journey story, starting when I was telling stories in front of audiences for entertainment, but also at the early stages of my business and I felt like I needed a story that expressed power and strength that wasn't mine. Like it was
Hmm.
someone else's.
Right.
And that's sort of, I guess, esoteric the way I just said it, but it felt like I had to be someone else in my story to
Right.
get to a certain type of story, a certain type of result, a certain type of messaging. And it was this inner struggle. And I think I always was resisting it, but I couldn't really fully identify why it didn't sit well with me. And then in February of 2020, I'm on NewYorkTimes.com, and there's this opinion piece written by this woman named Britt Marling, and she is a writer, director, actor. She had a brilliant science fiction show that was on Netflix called The OA, and she's done some films as well. And it was an article, something, the title is like, I don't want to be another strong female lead. And it's a beautiful essay and a beautiful series of stories about Britt Marling's life before she became an actor, and the sort of powerful woman role she had to live up to, like in the finance industry. And then when she was getting these strong female roles in film, they would get killed off or beaten or all of these things. And as I'm moving through this article, she brings up the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell, and talks about that structure with the inciting incident and the rising action and the climax and the denouement, the like happy ending resolution. And she compared it to a male orgasm. And I'm reading this article and I was like, oh, yeah. And then the end of the essay, and I'll make sure that you can share it in the notes,
Yes, please.
starts asking all these questions of like, well, what if there are other ways of telling stories? Like, what's the feminine journey story, and what happens if we imagine all of these different types of narratives then can come in. And I looked and I after I read that, I felt fully in myself and in my work, and I understood myself more, and I understood my approach to storytelling more. And I really like put a stake in the ground of like, yes, there is another way. We don't need hero's journey. It's not about this one person battling inner and outer demons and getting on top and everybody else is under them. There are other structures for storytelling, and especially in business and marketing, there are other ways to invite people into our experiences as the founder, business owner, leader. And so that was a really powerful moment for me. And from that point on, I've pretty much been on my anti-hero's journey train and inviting people to join me. But when I tell other people and invite other people to imagine other ways of telling stories, oh, the freedom it brings. And also, again, I think it helps people access that inner personal power versus this idea of like achieving power that structure brings about.
Yeah. I had forgotten about the orgasm thing, but that is just, yeah, I need to reread it. It's so good. And it is funny to me how, to me, it's a bit of an outdated way of looking at business or even life. And yeah, maybe it is because it's very male and strong surviving kind of thing, where if you look at it from the feminine approach, it would be completely different. And it also made me think of what we mentioned earlier. Maybe the client doesn't want heroes. Like we were told to tell this hero's journey because the client would look at us as having lived through these difficult times. And it's kind of this rag and riches story, right? That America loves. I just saw last week an article, oh, in America, we love some good rag to riches story. And it's
Yes.
true, right? That's part of the culture as well. But maybe the today's conscious client doesn't want those stories. And that's what I say in marketing, like we're human. It's like, well, I can't tell you that kind of story because I'm not there, I'm right here right now and I'm starting over. And so in a way, I feel like the conscious client wants to be on the same level, not hearing you how you have suffered and now you have succeeded and you're now a multimillionaire. So I think people have changed and consciousness has changed as well.
Yeah. And I work with a lot of clients that have service-based businesses. So whether they're like a mindset coach or they specialize in a specific topic, like I have a client that specializes in high functioning anxiety, and she's a former therapist turned coach.
Right.
And she has high functioning anxiety. So she's trained as a clinician and a therapist and understands it that way. But she has really tapped into saying, hey, this is something that can't be fixed and it doesn't go away. But here's what you can do to quiet it, to build self loyalty, to move through the world. And she has really found like people respond to her and say, I'm so happy that you shared this. I feel like I don't feel broken anymore. I feel like it's possible for me to live my life. And I understand that it doesn't go away. And I understand that you go through it, but you also know how to help. And so just again, it like builds a bridge and deepens those connections with an audience. And I do it myself in terms of like a lot of my clients, especially in their marketing endeavors, like they want to take up more space and be visible, but without the like big show or without, they want to do it as themselves, like so much of what you talk about. And I tell stories about how scary it can be to take up space or the struggles with visibility and where that fear comes in and where the like, oh, what if I'm perceived this way, or that kind of all of those what ifs and things. Like I still go through them as well. And sometimes there are better days and sometimes there are worse, and that's always going to be an ongoing issue and struggle.
Yeah. I feel like in a way the hero's journey is part of the old marketing paradigm as well, where
Yes.
we didn't share with transparency. We just shared, the 6, 7, 8 figure success, right? It's like, oh, look, I came from nothing and now I have an 8-figure business. where that just, I believe, definitely doesn't resonate with our audiences, but it also will no longer resonate as much with other people because we just want transparency. That's what we want today. So in a way, to me, the hero's journey, at least the way he saw it, kind of belongs to the past. We need to have different frameworks, and I'm so glad you're offering these.
One thing too about the hero's journey is there's a pressure for an ending that hasn't necessarily happened yet. And one thing I really appreciate that I heard you say in conversation with, I believe, Lisa, in your conversation about storytelling there, is this idea of the messy middle, and that when you let go of the hero's journey structure, there's so much storytelling that can happen about the messy middle that again serves you as the communicator, but also the audience in all of the ways we just talked about as well.
Exactly. That's what really connects with your audience. And then of course, you need to think about Brene Brown and think about the vulnerability and decide, well, what's the intention behind me sharing this? Is there integrity behind this, me sharing this, or because right now we all know that, okay, it sells to share with vulnerability. So obviously we don't just want to share it because it sells, but because we really want to connect and relate with our audience. But yeah, the messy middle, that's where the good stories are, right?
Yeah. And I think one set of questions I take myself through and take my clients through is why am I telling this story? And what do I want my listener to do once they've heard this story? And I feel like when those questions are answered and identified, it's like the checklist of integrity, the checklist of intentional vulnerability that's safe both for the communicator and for the audience. It's not manipulative, it's not oversharing, all of that. So I love that too. And again, I think going back to personal power, that gives you more inner strength as the communicator to be like, oh no, this is why I'm sharing this. And this is what I want them to do once they've heard, or hope that they'll do once they've heard.
Yeah, so good. You mentioned several times this term of taking up space. So how does being in your personal power and telling stories from that place, how does that help us with taking up space?
I found for myself, and I found it through storytelling, that when I was able to know myself and know how I wanted to share myself with other people, and then find those stories that I wanted to share, I was not afraid of taking up space, because it's this, like, my inner message of like, this is who I am. I know myself. I'm committed to myself, back to one of my superpowers. And I have a reason for sharing this story with you. So I have no choice but to take up space, because I'm doing it with intention and with the goal of this creating a dialogue, creating a connection. And so I believe that storytelling gives people that personal power to get comfortable being visible, to get comfortable taking up space, which marketing is getting comfortable being visible, getting comfortable taking up space as your authentic self and as the expert that you are, coming from that authentic, genuine place. So I think that it's like grounded in a trust of self, but then it's also, you have to trust your story and trust that it will communicate for you and do the work for you. And then there's that third piece, which is you have to also trust your audience in order to take up space and be visible. And that can be really scary too, especially if it's a audience that is landing on a web page and you don't know who they are, or listening to a podcast and you don't necessarily have a face or a name to connect.
Yeah. And I feel like if you're doing that deeper work of really figuring out, okay, what is the core story, and not like we mentioned before, what was my education, what are my accolades and accreditations and all of that, then you're taking up space from a different place, not from necessarily the ego, but probably from your gut more. And so it's not an intimidating space or a ego driven space. It's just like grounded space in a way. It's like, here I am, this is what I believe in, this is what I stand for, you like it, great. I open my arms. If you don't like it, feel free, go to the next person. That's
Yeah,
what I perceive.
I love that visualization of open arms, and like I think of it as like a heart-centered
Right.
way of like your story's coming out of your mouth, but it's also coming out of your heart. And I think it takes a bit of like I've never sky gone skydiving or bungee jumped, but I think it's this idea of like letting the trust in self, trust in story, trust in audience be a letting
Mm.
go in the moment and saying like,
Mhm.
this is, yeah, what you said, this is who I am, this is what I believe, this is what I have to offer the world, here I go.
Mhm.
And it can feel really scary at first, but it's the most freeing feeling to communicate from that space versus any other space of trying to fit into a template or a formula or put on a character or a facade. Like it just isn't worth it.
Yeah. So what would you tell someone, tell our listeners if they want to, get this deeper trust and probably figure
Mm.
out their superpowers to start from where would they go?
Yeah, I mean, it really does start with a trust in self. And I think there's a lot of brainstorming work, like even just sitting and thinking, what stories from my life are even coming to mind immediately? And without trying to bring in the logical of like, well, why is this coming to mind and all that, but just trusting the memories and the brainstorming ideas that are coming to the surface and just logging them in some way.
Mm-hmm.
I make my clients have something called a story bank. I think
Mm-hmm.
your Lisa mentioned something about a story bank
Mm-hmm.
as
Mm-hmm.
well. But just logging your brainstorming ideas there and keeping them there and holding on to them for the time when you're ready to explore it as a story. So I take my clients through like a 2 hour brainstorming experience as part of the work that they do. But I know a lot of my story ideas have come from just like a flash of a memory that I had or an object that's in my space that reminds me
Mm.
of something. So I would say that's a really great place to start in terms of cultivating the trust. And then it's a
Mm-hmm.
matter of, ooh, let me go with this one idea and let's see what happens if I add a beginning, middle, and end. I maybe write some around it, practice telling the story in an off the cuff way to a friend, and then building trust in the story and the storytelling and what that can do for you. I would say those are the good places to start. The trusting audience stuff can definitely take longer to
It's a muscle,
cultivate.
right? That you kind of need
Yes.
to practice. Yeah.
Yeah.
What I would add also is this creativity thinking. Like
Mm.
what I wrote about in the book is this idea of, for probably a decade now, we know about storytelling, but if you come from this left brain thinking analytical mind of I have to do marketing and now I have to, you know, tell stories in my marketing, your left brain is an overtrained muscle where your right brain is an undertrained muscle. And so your left brain will always want to bring in some techniques and features and benefits, and those don't make for a good story, right? Where really the right brain is bringing in the creative storytelling approach. And so I would say, yeah, bring in some creative activities, let that brain take off and experiment freely. To me, it really was when I understood storytelling is when my right brain turned on. I'm like, oh, okay. So it's more about connecting with my audience and not about, making them do something or buy something or any of that. So I think that was, yeah, important to share here.
Yeah, and I think listening to other people's stories, whether
Mm,
it's like in someone else's marketing, but also just like watching videos of storytellers on YouTube or listening to storytelling podcasts.
right.
Anytime I hear someone really like in their story and sharing, I'm connected to it, but at the same time, it's helping me think of stories from my life that I want to
Right.
share.
Yeah.
And also, I know when I go for walks or exercise, my ideas always come to the surface, and I always have like a either on my phone or a notepad next to me. I just shared a story about my dentist in my newsletter, and that appointment was in July, I think. So I was sitting with that story, just brainstorming wise until I was ready to share it and had a reason to share it with my audience as well.
Mm. Yeah, that's good. There needed to be a reason, right? Because obviously,
Mhm.
otherwise, yeah, it's just a story. But if there's a reason for the story, then it always is more compelling. Yeah,
Yes, for
yeah.
sure.
This has been so good. Thank you so much for sharing a different, very refreshing and radical approach to storytelling. I really appreciated it. Let people know where they can find you and find out more about your way of doing things.
Sure. So the best place to connect is on Tell Me a Story's website, which is tellmeastory.info. And there's also a link on that page to something called the Speak Up Session. It's a monthly free gathering that I host virtually all around storytelling and taking up space and visibility. And there's typically a guest storyteller that is jumping off the ledge, ready to share their story with a wonderful, warm audience, and then opportunity to kind of dive into your own storytelling and communication challenges. So I invite anyone listening that wants to check that out to sign up and come.
Wonderful. Yeah, we'll make sure we add that link in the show notes as well. Thank you so much. I have one last question, Hillary, and that is,
Mm.
what are you grateful for today or this week?
Mm. I mean, this is very literal, but I'm really grateful for our conversation. And I'm also grateful that I reached out to you. I used my voice to reach out with you many months ago because you and your work really resonated and we had such a lovely conversation. And so I'm grateful for this relationship that has been built and for being in conversation with someone that is so aligned. It's really lovely. And I'm just a fan of your work, and your work is important and much needed. So thank you.
Thank you. And likewise, thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for watching and being part of a generation of marketers who cares for yourself, for your clients, and for the planet. We really are change makers before we are marketers. So go ahead, be the change you want to see in the world. And I hope to see you again next week. Take care.